Thanks. Hi, everybody. My name is Siobhan Nealand, and I am a senior leadership recruiter focusing mostly on diversity. And I'm excited to have you guys here. So I created something called the Virtual Leadership Lounge. I currently work for Amazon, for AWS, and I have created a program called LEAP, which is Leadership Engagement Advancement Program. And one of the things that I've really found in my career is that businesses are looking for leaders and people to fall into this category. And candidates think that their career path on the resume falls into this category. But what I find is they don't actually always meet up, is that nobody is like sort of really looking at the same data points. And so I really sort of created this sort of matchmaking process so candidates can be better advocates for themselves and businesses can be better at looking at candidates through a different lens and with less bias and less assumptions. So a little bit about me. I have been in staffing and recruiting for a very, very long time. Won't tell you how long. And I have had my own staffing consulting companies for a very long time, and consulted for companies like Google and for most top 500 consulting companies doing with sourcing and recruiting and profile development and building out diversity programs for them. And then I've been at Amazon for 9 years, off and on. First 5 years was as a contractor, and then the last 4 years as an employee. In the last 3.5 years, I've really spent more time in leadership, sort of borderline executive recruiting at Amazon in AWS. And this is where I really started to look at some holes that I see in the recruiting process. I've seen throughout my career, but I felt like I really started to come to a process of how we could solve that problem. So, so a little bit about me. This LEAP event, I've started about 3.5 years ago through the Leadership Diversity Recruiting Program, is really thinking about things and stepping back. We're taught to look at our resume, write some basics about who we are and what we do. But what we don't really do is a resume is actually a marketing tool. It's telling the world who we are. But we don't really write our resumes like it's a marketing tool. We don't really explain who we are. And so what I hope to do in this process is sort of coach you guys through this process and give you a little bit more insight about how to think about this through a different lens. I'm not going to really say anything that you probably haven't heard in some way or another, but maybe just sort of thinking about how to really apply this to yourself. We can't control how, almost companies right now are on huge diversity initiatives. They're driven because of public pressure or because they're starting to realize that their products and services are not going to sell as well or the market value if they don't have diverse teams to representate their company, their customers, right? So if you don't have diverse representation to build your products and services, there's just no way you're going to scale at the market level to solve those kinds of problems, because you need diverse teams to be able to build those out economically. So I think more and more companies are seeing that. But what you still see is that we're still approaching hiring diverse teams with the same old ways of mechanisms. We've all been taught through a very masculine lens, not that there's anything wrong with that, but the majority of what we do comes from this sort of a lens of everything needs to look at this. And what I have really started to see is that most things are actually much different than that. And we need to be more proactive about how we communicate our interviewing process through that. So some basic interesting points of data are the Society of Human Resource Management surveyed random organizations and members within the United States. And they found out that within the first 4.3 minutes, most people are made a decision about where they're going to move forward with that interview. The second data point is that when we encounter as humans 11 pieces of information any given second, we can only process 40 to 50 of those. So shortcuts are going to be made. These are some basic things that we just sort of kind of brush over and don't really think about. I can't control what other companies or people or places are doing. But what I can control is my own ability to sort of be an advocate for myself. And what I can coach is my candidates to do the same thing, right? I can coach you of how you can start to tell the story, tell that marketing tool on LinkedIn and your resume and your interviewing process about how you can get through the interviewing process a little bit better. Most of this is skewed versus I've adjusted this a little bit, but it's a coaching. I have this interviewing coaching that group calls that I do for leaders to go through the Amazon process. So it's a lot of the similar slides. I've added a little bit of information, just more geared towards this, because this isn't just about Amazon. Any company that I've worked for, the coaching part of my job is really sort of where I've helped give my candidates that extra up, where they become better advocate for themselves. So what you want to do is use this data of like, okay, well, how do I actually communicate who I am in that 4 to 3 seconds, in that first 5 minutes of an interview? How do I take those 40 to 50 bits of information of the 11 million pieces of information that they're getting? How do I help drive that? Now, I can't 100% control it, but I can start to be a better advocate in how I do that in my interviewing process, and how I bring up that key leadership examples of things that I've done. So here's some of the tools of like, you want to treat your interviewers like you would treat a customer. Most of you are in product. You're used to getting all the criteria and clarifying questions about how you would build that product or that service, or how you would build out a program, or how you would execute a longer term strategy. So these are all things that you're used to doing in your day-to-day, and your head down doing the actual practicality of your work. But what's so interesting is most people don't do this with their career. So you really want to approach your career like you would approach a software development program, how you would approach a product leap, how you would do a marketing strategy. You would already think about all these different pieces that you would add. But again, we tend to not do that for our interviewing. So, diversity is sort of this topic right now. And as women, we come forward like it's pretty obvious most of the time that we're women, right? So this is a piece of who we are. Or if we have race, or if we have language, or if we come from another country. Sometimes we sort of think of this as like, oh, we want to make sure we hire people from these things. But diversity is this intersectional piece that includes our skill sets too. It's not just our diversity around our race or our gender or our sexuality or our language. It's also like, my thing is that I see, especially with women a lot, is they end up going in, they'll have 3 different degrees, one in law, one in software development, and one in marketing. And then a hiring manager looks at that and thinks, I don't know where to put them. They don't know what they want. They don't look like this. So how are you going to communicate that? I saw on Grace, when I was speaking on a panel at Grace Hopper 2 years ago, I was on a panel with a woman. She was amazing. And she had those 3 degrees. She was a VP. And the way she described it is she helped execute and explain that she was a great technically. That's why she had a software development leadership. She could use her legal degree to help with software negotiations and different legal matters around software. And then she could market that software and help with the product management team of that. So she helped drive those 3 degrees that seemed completely unrelated and helped create like a 3-sentence pitch about herself to be able to say how those 3 degrees and how she could help solve the problems of the people that she was interviewing with. That was a great example of, she was also a female leader. They needed a female leader. She talked about, the differences in her skills. And also she was from a different, country. So she was bringing all these different pieces that would solve that company's problems in a cross-sectional way. So I brought this slide. I use this for a bias training slide, but I like to also use it in interviewing, is that we learn a lot of these things about when we're interviewing and how we want to have diverse teams. And we think about this as like, oh, we want to hire diverse, but we don't think about it from the reverse of how we want to do this as being the candidate or as the hiring manager. We want to also look at like, what is missing? Did I hire all software developers and nobody else has any product management, or nobody else has any marketing, or comes from any of these other more different types of skill sets that are going to create some more balance in this team? These are the kinds of things you want to think as a hiring manager. And then as an interviewer, you want to say, here's what I can bring to the table. While my technical depth is at this level, but I also have these skills that can, are off the charts. And then here's how I can bring success to your team. And you want to be able to have language around that. So I don't know, here we go. So some of the other things that I have seen in, like what I see with, especially with women a lot, but I also see this with people who come from different cultures or maybe even a different country, about how they present themselves on their resume or their LinkedIn. I mostly work with leader of leaders. And that means I need to know like how long they've been in the industry, how long they've been a manager, how long they've been a manager or managers. And like what I see with women a lot too is that they were in an acting role as a leader. Some VP left, they were sort of running that team, managing that team, but they didn't get that title. So that title is not on their resume or their LinkedIn. So because they didn't officially have that title, but they ran in that role and they sort of did that for 2 years or something of that nature. You want to make sure you have a talking point around that like, while you didn't have that official title, here's where I was in an acting role and I took care of these things, because that shows a story where you stepped up to take care of things for that company when they didn't have, anybody to sort of stand in that role. And then how many people are you managing in your current role? Like, is this anywhere on your resume or your LinkedIn? Or do you have talking points about this? These are the kinds of things that what I see is, I just was speaking with a leader, was it like, I don't know, whatever, it was last week, I think. And I asked her, I was like, so she was referred to me by one of my executives. So I talked to her and I was like, what are you sent me some links of what you're interested in, but all of those are individual contributor roles. Are you interested in individual contributors? Or do you have management? Because it's hard to tell from your resume. Turns out she'd been managing huge teams of 400 people, managers for, over 5 years, teams of 20 managers with huge teams. Nowhere in her resume or LinkedIn. So an interviewer is going to meet with her and automatically assume, because she's interested in individual contributor roles and it's not on her resume, that she probably is only an individual contributor. Or if she's only been, I think her current role was an individual contributor role. Her last roles were where she had all that. There's nowhere to explain that. So she knows this. And when we go into the interviewing seat, it's sort of weird. We forget to be advocates for ourselves and we'll forget to talk about this piece, right? Like that you've had these managers and that you actually still want to manage managers. You still want to be in a leadership role. Now, if you want to be an individual contributor and you've been a manager, then you also have to make sure you're clear about communicating that. I think both. So I think those are the kinds of things that you want to really pay attention to. Some other areas where I see, like I just recently hired a woman who she had been promoted into a bunch of roles, but they ended up moving away from her technical expertise. So she wasn't able to really have the technical depth that she had in the beginning of her career. Most of the roles that she was interested in had a lot of technical depth to them. So she didn't think she could qualify. She already sort of talked herself out of that she could be a part of that. And then I started asking her, well, do you have side projects? Do you have a nonprofit? Is there anything you do that's technical outside of your normal role? She's like, oh yeah, I built an app and it's built on AWS and it, launches to 1 million people, right? Like nowhere on her resume, nowhere on her LinkedIn. And these are, I talk with amazing leaders that are doing amazing things, heads down, doing the work. But what I see happen is that they start to go in that unconscious place where they look at, they just sort of think of the next thing. They don't really calculate what they've done in their career and they aren't documenting it. And they can't even really remember exactly how many managers they had, how big their teams were, how big. Now, again, I'm thinking more from this executive perspective of like how you want to know what your framework was. Like, what is the trajectory of your career? Because you have maybe a half hour, maybe 20 minutes to really explain who you are and what your career is. You have to have a bit of a framework and an elevator pitch about what the basics and the fundamentals are of who you are as a leader and who you are as an individual contributor and what are some of the the things that tie it all together for you. Because again, human nature, they see 11,000 bits of information a second. They need those 40 bullet points to look like this. That's what most humans want. They want it to just look uphill. It makes really sense. Most women's careers are like this. Most people in diversity got promoted a lot. They stayed at a company a lot. So it's like hoopty hoops. And they haven't interviewed in 5 years, 10 years. And so their interview skills are terrible, but they're great at the job. They're great leaders. They're great executives. It's more about they don't know how to talk about their own experience. And so these are just some really simple, basic things that I coach candidates to do of like, let's just think about what your current role is, how many managers you have, how many individual contributors you have. If you've been an individual contributor, you can use the same thing. What are the projects you worked on? What did you manage? What were the results of it? You can kind of still break down these things, or even like, where do you want in your career growth? Where do you want to be? Do you see anybody who has a career of like how many managers they have and how many individual contributors? Is that what you want? Is that where you want to go? Like for me, I am the CEO and founder of an organization outside of Amazon. That helps impoverished women have babies safely in Africa. And I've managed about 50 people internationally. I've been doing that for 13 years. I love being a manager in my own company. I don't really like being a manager in a corporate world. I like being an individual contributor and having hands-on things. So I'm very clear about what part of me wants the individual contributor piece and what part of me wants the leadership piece. So you have to be able to have that advocacy. I know that I saw some of the panels that were talking about, like, if you're going to work with a sponsor, you have to be very clear about what it is you want, where you're going. And you have to do the same thing with the interviewing process. You can't just, most companies like Amazon and Google and most of the high tier companies that I recruit for, you have to be very clear about who you are, where you've been, and where you want to go. And you have to really dive deep into that. Some of the lower tier companies might just ask you like, oh, tell me about your career, tell me what you did, and kind of just, it's a little bit of storytelling. But at companies like Amazon or again, like Google, they want you to dive deep and tell the mechanisms, the processes, who you are, what your teams you manage, how did you lead those to success? Like, how did you manage to success for those customers? They want to understand how you, and in this case, in this audience, you built a product. How did you build it to success? How did you lead a team to success? They want to understand those kinds of things. So some of the case studies I have, like one of the things that I see is that like lower level talent, people who've still earlier in their career, tend to actually sometimes do better in interviews than people who've been in their career a long time. Part of that is they haven't interviewed in a long time. So make sure you're practicing your interview. You've got your interview chops. You've really gone back through your career and look at what are some of those highlights, which I'm going to go through some exercises of how to do that. And be able to be some advocacy around that, because most, the percentage of women will lead. Like I've had some of the top, one of the top women at Apple, top women at Google in technology interviewing with me, and say they led with what they were not good at, bar none. They were like VPs at these companies, built out whole divisions or organizations and products, and still were leading with what they didn't do well yet. Instead of, whereas my male candidates a lot of times will lead with what they're good at. The adage of if you give a job job description to a man and a woman in most gender studies, there's 10 bullet points to that. A man will see that he can do 5 of those and will apply right away and will lead with the 5 things, like in his presentation of or his email. Here's why I'd be great at for this. A woman may apply if she has 8 of those, maybe 9 or 10. And if she only has 8, she will probably lead with the 2 things that she doesn't feel like she has those skills. That's just, there's all these gender studies that sort of talk about that. There's also pieces where there's a little bit more around studies around that from cultural backgrounds too, or different countries. Like when I was recruiting in Singapore, there's definitely some cultural things there that go along with how people interview or present themselves. Like it's considered bad form to talk about yourself in a boastful way. So whether you're a man or a woman. So, I think there's different places where you want to really like build up your case studies and really practice where are you interviewing. or how do you kind of get your chops back up to interviewing? I kind of talked about being promoted at a company. I hired a great leader who just was excelling in always in solutions architecture, was considered one of the top in that region. But he'd been at the same company for 10 years and hadn't interviewed. So while he was exceptional at his job, in the interviewing process, he almost didn't make it. We ended up hiring him, and he's amazing. I had that hiring manager just tell me the other day, like, I'm so glad we hired him. But what he wasn't good at is he'd come from another country. He'd been at this one company this whole time, and he didn't know how to talk about all his successes. He didn't know how to talk about how he'd take some of those failures and turned them into successes. So we had to coach him for like 2 or 3 months to get him to that place of being able to talk about his career and how to get himself through that interviewing process. I think I kind of already talked about the leader who fits in multiple job families. So you're going to have to explain, like, if you've been a product manager for a portion of your career, then you went over to marketing, then you went over to sales, now you're back in product manager. You got to tell a story of how that's going to benefit your customer. And you're going to need to have it in a quick elevator pitch at first. You can dive deeper into your conversation in the interview later. But remember, if they're probably going to make a decision about you in that first 5 minutes, are you giving them the right data points to make that decision about you? And this is where we can have more control over, the part of our own career and how we get through the interviewing process and lead to more success. I have a higher ratio of candidates that make it to onsite and offer stage based on doing some of these techniques and building this stuff, their advocacy for themselves through this process, and really acknowledging the areas where we're weak. Like, part of why I teach this is that this was a really big problem for me. Always leading with what I'm not good at, always leading with I'm not enough for something, or, oh, well, I don't have that education, or, right. So learning to see that in myself, and then then I see that in these really amazing, especially women that were like not like saying these things about themselves. And I'm like, you're the only person in this industry who even does this. Like, what are you talking about? So then coaching them and seeing this sort of need for that. So see that in yourself. Where are the places where, oh, wow, this makes me uncomfortable and I see someone else do it. Am I doing that? Kind of ask some self-reflection on those kinds of more EQ pieces of ourselves. Because most people are doing the degrees and they're doing the technical work and they're doing the actual work heads down. It's just the talking about their work that they struggle with. And that is when I coach that. I'm fascinated to see how people move farther up the interviewing process. So creating this sort of strategy for yourself around your interviewing strategy, like you would, like we discussed, for a product or a service or a customer. So at Amazon, we have something called the leadership principles. If you haven't had a chance, go look at those. A lot of companies are trying to frame their models around this. But I think, there's 2 things that we interview for in any role at Amazon, and one's leadership principles and the other is technical acumen, based on the technical roles. I mostly work on technical roles. So even if you're not going to interview for somewhere like Amazon, the leadership principle, or a great way to start, is that this gives you sort of some ways to build out case studies for yourself. So what I tell candidates here who are interviewing for Amazon, but even when I took a break from Amazon and I worked over at Visa and a few other places, I would kind of use this same model of like breaking down, using those leadership principles to where did you solve a business problem and a technical problem as a leader, and influencing your teams to solve that business problem or technical problem. There's 14 leadership principles. That's going to give you 28 examples of case studies of your career. And when I moved from being a contractor to Amazon to an employee, I was terrified because most people don't pass the interviews, even if they've been working at Amazon a long time. So I took my own little pad, took my own advice, wrote out all the leadership principles, and wrote out, the behavioral questions that I knew would come with it. Now, most people don't know what those behavioral questions are going to be. So you really don't know. You're just going to build these case studies out for yourself. And again, this is just homework for yourself to be able to be more, dive deeper into your own career and ask some questions and have advocacy for yourself. So most of those questions are going to be, tell me about a time you did such and such. Then what did you do? Why did you do that? Did it drive revenue? How did it help the customer? Was there successes? Were there failures? They're going to ask 5 to 7 layers deep in this kind of interviewing process. And more companies are copying sort of the Amazon style of interviewing. So it's just really good practice. And what will happen is you'll have this really nice, like, what are the mechanisms? What are the processes? What are the methodologies that you created, whatever that work product was at XYZ company, and you built this out from scratch? And how did it end up? Did it drive revenue? Did it drive adoption? Whatever the pieces are, pull those out. And then you'll start to see, like for me, I've been building recruiting programs out for a very, very long time. And when I looked at it, it actually helped my own self-esteem of like, oh, wow, I actually have done so much more than I give myself credit for. And even in my own interviewing process with Amazon, they had asked me, about the program I had built out at Google. And I couldn't remember the 10-point bullet plan that I had built out because I was doing it every day. I was in the automatic pilot place, just doing it. And so I couldn't call it out. And that's what I see leaders do on a regular basis is they built this whole thing out, or but they just do it. They know exactly what to do and they go do it. And if you've been in your career for 10, 20, 30 years, you just know what to do. But when someone asks you about it in an interview, you're like, what? Wait, I know I did it. What was it? So if you flushed it out using these leadership principles, which are like learn and be curious, customer obsession, dive deep, vocally self-critical, this is going to start helping you think of different examples, and you'll probably touch on other leadership principles, and you'll touch on those mechanisms and methodologies and processes and those computer science fundamentals or program management fundamentals, or whatever the technical expertise is yours. You'll build those foundational pieces and you'll have these great case studies of your career. Then you take it to the next step and you go the STAR method. And most people, I think most companies now sort of interview with the STAR method that I've worked with. And the STAR method is you say the situation, a task, what's the action, and what are the results. So now that you've kind of got these 28 case studies and you've kind of have really dived into all these like details and narrative, now you want to make it really concise so that when someone asks you a question about your career, you can be really concise, bulleted, clear. And in that 5 minutes, you can make a very like clear, concise picture that looks like this for your interviewer to think of you, instead of the hoop-de-hoops that your career probably was, right? Well, I did this and then I went and did this. Like we've all listened to someone say that and then we're already lost by the second sentence, right? So we want to make sure that we have concise, STAR type situation, task, action, results, storylines that we can sort of then embed our processes, our programs, our methodologies, and those kinds of things into some nice bulleted points, so that we know that when we're talking about that, particular job in that particular time frame, these are some of the highlights that I like, were really special about that, or what made it work, or why this particular program failed. But then what happened is we created and innovated this whole new software program that now took over the world, right? So these are the kinds of things that you want to build out and talk for yourself. And then the other piece is, what I tell people for Amazon and AWS especially is most really high tier companies are asking their leaders to be extremely technical deep. Like Amazon probably does this to the nth degree. And so most leaders at other companies aren't expecting their leaders to have the type of technical depth that we expect them to. And I think there's, like we've kind of heard in some of the panels today, I think as women, we feel like we have to prove ourselves more from a technical aspect. So we dive a little bit deeper. So one of the things that I do is have my candidates take some sort of AWS cloud certification and talk about their technical skill sets and our framework, so that you're communicating in the language of the company that you're interviewing for, but you're utilizing the technical background that you have if that's your area. Now, if it's not full on technical, maybe you have a marketing background that there's a certain technology or certain methodology that is fundamental in that area. So then that would be your technical expertise. but you may want to find out whatever company you're interviewing for, what do they do? What's their language, so that you can communicate your technical background and frame it in a way that they will actually hear you and see how you could add value to their company. Again, we're not lying or doing anything that's not on our resume, but what we're doing is we're taking our experience and we're framing it so people can digest it and they can see it in that very short minute of 30 minutes to 45 minutes that we have in an interview, to try to explain a 20-year career or to try to explain who we are. And we can get considered for leadership roles that maybe we might not have been considered for if we are able to be advocates for ourselves. So those are some of the highlights. I'm not sure the question feature is working. So I don't know. I'd like to get Pamela.
Yeah, Siobhan, thank you so much. That was fantastic. So many eye-opening and specific takeaways, as always, listening to you speak. As we see if we can resolve the issue with the questions coming in from our live audience, there are some other questions that I think, or at least hope, could be helpful for the audience to hear. One, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 skills for someone to hone that is aspiring to or preparing for a leadership role?
I think the biggest thing is like, really, I see that being able to really show how you lead teams to success, how you lead up, how you manage up, and how you manage down, like, and how do you develop that relationship with both managing your executives to success as well as your teams to success, and having a dialogue and a language around that is critical. And you know, the leaders that I work with that are the most successful, like, if you get a chance, there's a woman I support. Her name's Francesca Vasquez. She's the director over Worldwide Solutions Architecture. She has a way of making everybody just feel like you're her. She's so strong, so powerful. She can lead. She makes the leaders above her feel like they're connected and part of and part of know what's going on. And then she also makes all of her teams, which I think she has like 2,000 people who report to her, feel like they're just all part of it. Like there is not this sort of not quite same hierarchy. Like there's this team environment. And I think that's something really hard to communicate in an interview. So like, how are you going to be that in your interview? How are you going to show that in your interview? And I see the candidates that can sort of take that. So I'll give you an example of a candidate that I had in process last year for this, what's called the Leadership Engagement Advancement Program event. She had come from IBM, been at the same company for like 20 years. She said, I don't know. She was doing okay in her interviews, but not great because she hadn't interviewed in so long. She's like, I don't know if I have much to share because, you know, I've been at IBM and it's not Amazon. And this is what she led with. And so I asked her, well, what did you drive revenue? Did you move a team? Did you have any sort of success with a product or a service? She's like, oh yeah, for the last 10 years, I've driven revenue 10% year over year. And I was like, okay, I'm not sure why you didn't lead with that. She's like, oh my God, I don't know why I didn't lead with that either, right? But she hadn't interviewed in 10 years. And so this is where you build out those case studies. But then she also, and then we coached her through a little bit about what we're talking about of how she led teams and how she managed the team, you know, her leaders and how she managed the teams below her. And that really, she knocked it out of the park in her interviews. Like, and part of it is we spent a lot of time on really pulling out what was the success of her career and why she had driven that 10% revenue. And that part of it was so much about the EQ, but she had to like sort of comfortably share that. Whereas in the beginning of our interviewing process, you know, in the 6-week process of getting her through this, she was really shy at first and didn't think she had it. And maybe I'm not good enough for that. And like, I don't know if I fit for Amazon, but you know, she's totally doing great. She's works here now. She's doing great. And so I think these are those kinds of things where it's like, that little subtle change of being to be a better advocate for ourselves and being able to also help take our interviewer on the journey with us, right? Like, but we can't do it in a lot of words, because as soon as, and this is another common thing that I see with people who haven't practiced interviewing in a while, you start rambling. I know I do that. I have to really practice. I'm a rambler. I love to chat, 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 chat. And so like, I have to really have, wait, you know, it's kind of cool about the virtual world now, right? Like have bullet points in front of me about how, you know, what are my talking points? So keep me on track, right? Like, so, you know, make sure you have some of that for yourself, and then practice with some people. Again, most of my top hires, just that usually I have a hiring or executive come back to me and say, that was one of the best hires. We need to figure out how to hire more people like them. They were the shy, didn't interview very well. I actually specialize. I'll go find and stalk you all on LinkedIn, and I usually will find the people who don't have the resume up, don't have much information about themselves, and I can tell haven't interviewed in 10 years. Those are the people I like to go and coach, because usually they have their heads down and doing their work. Now, that's not what most recruiters do. I'll tell you right now, they're looking at search terms. They want key criteria. They're looking for a red ball, a blue ball, a pink ball. They're looking for the criteria that their hiring manager gave them, and that's all they're looking for. They're not like me, who's trying to like, I don't know, sort of have this emotional intelligence experience with my candidates, right? So for you, you have to then give them that. You have to give those both so they can find you. Then once they find you, that you don't lose them because you didn't talk about yourself in a way that fits that place. So I think the biggest part is being able to really communicate how you are a leader and how big the teams are. Because I have to say, one of the other big things that is, recruiters and hiring managers will assume that you are not a manager if you do not put it in there, and especially if you're a woman. I am just fascinated to see how often that happens. So make sure you're spelling this out in your resume, in your LinkedIn profile, and then also in your interviews. Like, you know, I've managed teams. This is how the large teams I do. Have a nice 2-sentence blurb about how you do that. And then you can, you know, they might ask you more questions, or, oh, I really want to know about your technical depth. Like, what do you do? So then make sure you also, like, if you're not doing a lot in your current technical role, make sure you can really talk to where you're getting your additional technical training, right? Those seem to be the two big things of like how leaders lead, and then what is their technical depth. And especially for women, you know, honestly, that is a bias that we hear over and over again. Well, is she technical enough? All right. Whereas most of the women technical leaders I have can run circles around a lot of the other male leaders I have, right? But I think making sure that that's just not a question, that you have some talking points about how to talk about yourself for that way. Any other questions?
Yeah. Could you share some examples of the differences in how men and women answer the same question? I think I've heard you speak before, and you gave very good examples of how stereotypically, this is, of course, how a male may answer a question versus how a woman may answer a question, and how that can obviously very much impact your success or lack thereof with the interviewer. So how can a woman or someone else answer some of those questions very differently than a male or someone else that answered them much better or much more impactfully?
That's a great question. And I think, again, these are generalizations. I've seen, you know, men who answer this too. I think a lot of times if some people come from some sort of a marginalized community, or they didn't have, you know, the same access to certain types of resources, I think this is where I see the question is like this. I had a candidate about someone referred somebody to me who, you know, I usually work in diversity. So I usually work with women and minorities and people from how have multiple job families who kind of fit in sort of a diverse skill set. So I tend to work in these sort of more marginalized leadership pools. But every now and then people refer someone over to me who's a leader. And so I spoke with a leader who came from Harvard, came from like, and I was just so like taken aback by how he answered. Like I was like, well, tell me how the teams you manage. Oh, I managed this and I did this and we grew this revenue, this, and we did this and we did, like, he just went boom, boom, boom. And I had just talked to a candidate about the same level, same type of company, similar background. And she's like, well, I've managed some teams, but then I did this and then they had me over here. So she did the long, like, explaining story. Now, her background was just as good, if not better. But what really was so striking to me was how well he advocated for himself compared to her. And and how much I had to coach her to just be a better advocate for herself. Again, their work was pretty equal. It wasn't about one seemed like they had a better background or anything, but he was much better at explaining it. And you could see that he had had mentors or coaches by the way he answered that question, by the way he had his resume. And again, I don't talk to as many of those candidates as much anymore. I tend to talk to a lot of women candidates who are rock stars, but will lead with, well, I know I'm the only woman at Apple in this industry on the global scale, but I still feel like I'm not really as technically strong as some of my male counterparts. Like, I literally had a woman from Singapore who was a VP say this to me. And so I think those are those areas where I still just sort of get baffled. And my mentor here at Amazon, she was a VP, and I would tell her about my coaching and the things I have. And she's like, I had a recruiter approach me. And I also realized, even after everything you've told me, I got scared to say what I really, like all my successes. And she'd, been a rock star here at Amazon. And that she's like, what I wished the recruiter had asked me is, what would your manager for the last 5 years say about you? And so maybe, if you're a hiring manager, you can also maybe look at how do you ask more open-ended questions? Because part of that with my mentor and the woman in Singapore, they come from both cultures where it's inappropriate to be bragging. It's inappropriate to talk about yourself that way. Whereas like the male character that I was talking to you about, he was a white male from America. I think he's from Southern California. The culture was more like, that's what you do, right? And it was very clear that that was part of his culture. So I think these are those things where, well, if I come from a culture where I still feel this uncomfortability about talking about myself in this way, how do I work around that? So I have a self-deprecating humor. I use that, and I be playful. I actually was supposed to be a singer and a performer. I have no idea how I ended up being a recruiting leader. So I use my entertainment chops to sort of play around with that. When I'm speaking on the United Nations stage for my charity, and I'm speaking with celebrities, I'll use sort of humor or my sort of quirky personality, and I play with that, even though I used to have a lot of shame around it, that I don't have the same education as a lot of people, or I don't have the same background, or now I try to use it as an asset. And if I claim it first and I use it as part of what makes me diverse and what makes me unique and what makes me good at what I do, but it took me a while to be able to own that for myself. And I think that's where what I do in a one-on-one coaching with candidates is I try to help them find that for themselves. What's that voice for yourself? And I think that's at the end of the day. And like, I've done it for male, female candidates. It doesn't really matter, because everybody, we're all on our own journey trying to figure out, how do I be an advocate for myself? And we're not even taught that. And most recruiters are not going to ask you those questions. They're going to tell you how to prep for a phone screen by learning a couple technical things and give you a little bit of clues, but they're not going to talk about this behavioral piece that we're all ingrained in. And this stuff we have to do for ourselves. And so the work I've been doing is really helping me see how much I feel like 75% is behavioral, and it's our own way that we can change things for our career. So I'll leave you with a little story right before I go. So I was having problems with my own career, and I would watch recruiters that were not necessarily as, I don't know, have the same results that I had. Let's just put it that way. But they were male, and they were so good at being advocates for themselves. And they just seemed to be able to like negotiate the political, the interviewing piece, the career path better than I did. But they weren't as good at their job as I was, in my opinion. Say it, probably shouldn't say that, but they couldn't get the actual results that I got. And so what I started doing is like, well, what would my male counterpart do? Or what would a man on a golf course do? How would that executive that I know is always on the golf course? This is when I was at another company. And I call them about a candidate, they're on the golf course and they just blubbered off. And I'm like, what would I do if I did that? So I started answering in sort of creating some sort of what I call PR statements for myself about how I was going to respond in these particular environments or these particular situations. Like one of those people, my career totally changed, completely changed. I just started saying, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I do it. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, this is what so-and-so would do. And nothing changed. My skill set has been the same. I haven't really changed that much of that, but what changed is the way I'm holding myself, the way that I present myself. Now, I don't want to act like a man. I want to act like an empowered woman and authentic version of myself. But I also don't want to be like, the typical stereotype of, oh, well, I don't know, which, still is in there too, right? So I kind of have to find the balance of like, how do I step into it? So I use my acting background, I use my theatrical background, and I'm like, okay, today I am this powerful leader and I can run this and I can run an organization in Africa. I can speak on the UN stage. I've got this, right? Like, I don't know. It's just sort of a fake it till you make it kind of thing. And I think these are those kinds of things that, like, the other thing I think we can do, especially as women, we get so serious. I need people to take me seriously. But what I notice with my male counterparts is they're laughing a lot more. They're sort of have a sort of a fun, challenging thing with it. They kind of dance with it a little bit more. And the more I started to do that, that was the element that I was adding that I didn't realize I was adding when I was pretending to be them, and adding a little bit more humor and dance. That sort of made it more authentically mine. And then nobody can take that from me. Then whatever, how I present myself, I'm really being the best advocate for myself because I'm being more authentic. And there's power in that. So I think we're close to time, but do we have a little bit more time for questions, or what else would you like? What else do you need?
Yeah, we have a little bit. I wanted to go back to what you mentioned about someone having 3 different degrees and perhaps not having a linear path to their vision of success. And your pitch, you can craft that. You can come up with how to connect those dots very easily. I'm wondering if you could share some helpful hints on how to maybe do that on your LinkedIn profile or on a resume where you have one page to somehow connect, these huge 3 very separate dots that probably took, 10 to 15 years to actually create. And you've got like 2 or 3 bullets to really get that point or all of those points across succinctly. So you could speak to that. It might be helpful.
For that example of that VP I told you had the 3 careers, she said it was a challenge, right? Like she really had to, like, in her summary, because you have to think of a recruiter. Most recruiters probably look at a resume not more than 5 seconds. Sorry to break it to you. All those bullet points and all those details you put in your resume, they're probably not going to go. So you really most recruiters are looking at what company you were at, what's your title, where you're located, and then they're looking for some key terms for what you're, like if you're a software developer or product management or marketing or whatever those key terms are, or if it's a certain software or technology. So again, most recruiters, not all, but most recruiters are really just retrieving a ball. They're looking for this thing. So one of the ways that you can do this is, like, if you know that you're really looking for a role that does software licensing and software development and has got sort of this interesting marketing thing, because you've got these 3 different degrees, this is like your dream, then you want to put that in your LinkedIn, up in your summary, and up of like, the combination of my 3 degrees helps me, build software licensing and market them, like make it into one sentence, because they only are going to read maybe 1 or 2 bullets of who you are. So, and then use the key criteria. So like if you're applying to a role, use the language that makes sense to that company, right? So if they're using the title of I can't think of something off the top of my head, but like you want to, like, the recruiter, your first line of thing is going to look at, oh, I want people who have product management in their title. But your title says liaison to product. That may not even register for a recruiter. So you're going to need to have some sort of note or some sort of thing of like, there's a continuity that shows why this would be a fit. Now, if you're doing a letter, or if you're sending an email with your resume or information, you can be more directed. But in your general LinkedIn profile or in your resume, you're going to have to find some ways to pull that story together in one or two bullet points. And that's not easy. The other thing is that if you're really interested in a role, try to find, people from that company. Employee referrals are the number one way to get into a company. So find ways to access to that, understand how their culture is, understand who you would want to talk to. How would you, like Amazon has a very quirky culture. Like very few people make it the first or second time around in our interviewing process unless they've been coached, because we have a language, we have a way of doing things that's just different. And so you doing it, this way that your company currently does it doesn't fit our culture. So you have to make sure, even though you may have the skill sets and you'd be great here, if you're framing it with a different language, it's not going to translate. So this is where you would, tie in, here's where I have multiple degrees. I use this to streamline efforts in ... right? So however you're going to pull those degrees together and show that you're not, because what happens a lot with women who have multiple degrees is it is assumed with those 11 million bits of information that they don't know what they want in their career. They're wishy-washy. So you have to show how you're not wishy-washy. You have to show that those 3 degrees mean you can do A, B, C, and D. And, a lot of times it's hard to show that in a resume or LinkedIn, but you need to have your pitch together as well for when a recruiter calls you or when you call a recruiter, that you can say, here's who I am and here's why I think I'd be a fit for this. And be really clear and direct and concise is the other piece.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Yeah.
Siobhan. This has been fantastic. Are there any little tidbits or extra nuggets you'd like to leave our audience?
No, I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to reach. I'm pretty terrible at getting back to LinkedIn. I get about 200 of those a day. Really, I think the bigger part is just get creative with your journey about who you are. The other way, I think I didn't quite finish answering this, is one of the ways that I do is I go look at like people who I feel like have the ideal role or the ideal, like, oh, that's where I want to be. So then you work backwards from that. Like if you want to be a VP of product, go look on LinkedIn and find top VPs of product. How do they present themselves? How do they manage their teams? Become their, have them as mentors, reach out to them, start to understand, and then look at, well, that's how they got their career there. Is that what I want to go? You need to ask yourself these questions, because this is going to also help you build your career trajectory. Like, especially if you're not a leader right now, like, how do you want to get to a leader? Do you even want to be a leader? Or are you like me, where you only want to lead in your own company, but in corporate, you want to be, in the weeds with the stuff, So I think those are the places where I would, spend some time of like creating a language about yourself with yourself first, before you start trying to, I see people try to jump into the interviewing thing, but they haven't practiced talking about themselves. And they've gotten certifications, they've got all these degrees, they've done all these jobs. And then in the interview, they completely bomb because they don't know how to talk about it and they just ramble. So just make sure you practice, find a buddy to practice with. Those kinds of things can make a really big difference.
That's great. Thank you so much. This has been such a great session.
Thank you.
Yeah, you were fantastic, of course. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah,
it's been great. Thanks AWS, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.